Hello, welcome to Unboxing a Deck. Today we're going to talk about this blue-red casual control deck. First, I want to start with a short introduction to the casual format. It isn't an official Magic format. It is also often referred to as kitchen table Magic, which is just playing with the cards you have lying around. So you can basically play whatever you want, which leaves the door open to play very powerful decks. But most of the time, when you hear somebody talk about kitchen table magic, they're referring to, yeah, just below standard level decks mostly. And, and this is one of those. And yes, I want to show it to you, talk about the card choices and the game plan, and give a couple of options you have to change this deck. And it is a very fun and cheap way to get into playing kitchen table magic. This deck contains almost no rare cards. It is mostly commons and uncommons, and you're still able to build a powerful blue-red control deck, which can be a great starting point to play some control if you haven't done this before in other 60 card formats. Starting off with the deck, we have our centerpiece card and also our finisher. This is Rise from the Tides from Shadows over Innistrad. It is a 6 mana sorcery spell, which puts a 2/2 black zombie creature on the battlefield tapped for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. So obviously we want to fill our graveyard with instant and sorceries. And after this we want to cast Rise from the Tides, flood the board with zombies and finish the game pretty quickly. To do that, we need to interact in the early turns with our instant and sorcery spells. So we have a suite of burn spells, counter spells, and some card draw spells to get ahead on cards and find our Rise from the Tides. Important to remember with this card is that the tokens come into play tapped. So when you cast the spell, you should be on a pretty good board position, because otherwise you might die because the tokens won't help you block in the first turn. Afterwards, you can obviously use them to block, or, which is more often the case, you can just attack and finish the game in one or two turns. So let's talk about the card draw spells first. We have Augur of Bolas, which is our only non-instant and non-sorcery card in the deck. It is a all-star from its first appearance in Standard, where he showed up in a couple of control decks. When he enters the battlefield, he looks at the top 3 cards of our library, and we can reveal an instant or sorcery card and put it into our hand. This is very useful. We can get a bit of board presence early in the game, find a spell that we want, and yes, this is just a 2-for-1, and if our opponent tries to kill this with a remove a spell, that is very beneficial to us because they're spending their time dealing with this creature, which we don't really care about, and don't spend their time developing more board pressure against us. This card is probably not the strongest option, but it is a cool little 2-drop, and it can be pretty neat at defending against creature decks that want to get on the board early. Another card draw option that we're using is Hieroglyphic Illumination from Amonkhet, which draws 2 cards for 4 mana at instant speed, which isn't the best rate, but it also has cycling for 1 blue mana. So if we want to dig for a land, we can just cycle this and draw a card, or if we want to dig for a counterspell, let's say. But also, if we are holding a Rise from the Tides, we can cycle this in the end step of our opponent and maybe cycle 1 or 2 of these, and we also have another cycling card that we are able to dump into the graveyard for just 1 blue mana. So this enables us to fill our graveyard with instant and sorcery cards, so the Rise from the Tides makes more tokens. It is a pretty cool card draw option in my opinion. We also have our big card advantage spell, Practical Research, which draws 4 cards, and then we have to discard 2 cards unless we discard an instant or sorcery card. We have some cheap burn spells that get medium to bad in the late game, because when our opponent is playing big creatures, they can't really interact with them very favorably. so we can just dump them with practical research and get a grip of new cards, which is very strong in the mid to late game. The last option that we're utilizing here is Everdream. This is a Modern Horizons 2 card, certainly not one of the power standouts from that set, but it is pretty sweet. It allows us to draw a card for 2 mana, which we are never really happy to do. We want to splice it onto an instant or sorcery spell. This is a very old mechanic um, from the start of the modern format in Kamigawa, and it enables us to cast an instant or sorcery spell and then reveal this card and pay 3 mana. And if we do, we splice this card's effect onto the instant or sorcery we're casting. So let's say we're casting a 1 mana red burn spell. We can just pay 3 additional mana, reveal Everdream from our hand, and draw an additional card. This is very slow, but it can be a very nice tool against other slow decks, because with every interaction spell we play, we also get our card back, so we don't fall behind on cards while interacting with them, and eventually we will pull ahead this way, which is good against other slow decks, and it is just a fun card to play with. Now we will talk about our interaction with the board. First of all, we have Galvanic Bombardment, which is our red burn spell of choice. For 1 mana, it deals 2 damage, baseline, but it increments with the number of Galvanic Bombardments in your graveyard. So in the early game, this kills small aggressive creatures, and in the later parts of the game, it even hits bigger creatures and takes them down, which is a neat tool for this deck. We also have 2 copies of Fire Ice, which is a pretty infamous card. It is very flexible, very strong. It can be a 2-for-1 if you're lucky, and it also can tap down big creatures, which can be a problem for this deck. It is obviously very good to tap down a land of an opponent if we know they are holding a more expensive spell, so they can't play it for 1 turn and draw a card. And we have Spikefield Hazard, which isn't a very strong spell, but it can be neat against recursive creatures, because if the permanent deal damage with Spikefield Hazard would die, then it is exiled instead. So this can be good against like a zombie deck or something like that, but it also has a backside, which we'll show later in the land section. But basically, this land, you can play this card as a land, and the land enters the battlefield tapped and produces a red mana. So it lets us get away with having a bit more instant sorceries in our deck, while still having enough lands to play a 6 mana card. Other board interaction we're utilizing are Pyroclasm, uh, Electrolyze and Rise Outburst. Electrolyze and Rise Outburst are both interaction with small creatures that give us a card back. So they are 2-for-1s, Electrolyze potentially a 3-for-1, and which is pretty sweet in this deck to find our Rise from the Tides while still interacting with our opponent's board. And Pyroclasm is our sweeper of choice. I'm just playing 1 because this deck doesn't really want to play a super long game. It doesn't need a sweeper that often because of the cheap burn and cheap counterspells. But sometimes 1 copy of Pyroclasm can be handy to deal with a board full of tokens or other swarmy creature decks. Now let's talk about the stack interaction. We have a suite of 2 mana counterspells here. Condescend can also be cast for more than 2 mana. It counters the spell unless their controller pays X. So the cheapest we want to cast it for is X equals 1 in the early turns. And we also get to scry 2, so we can set up our draws to find lands or find the spells we need. Another card that we are utilizing is Sensor. Sensor always counters the spell unless the controller pays 1, which is very good in the early game. And later in the game, we can just cycle it for 1 blue mana to dump it into the graveyard, fill our graveyard for Rise from the Tides, and draw a new card. Mana Leak is a very strong option. I'm choosing to just play 2 of them because I sometimes find them to be a bit too strong for some of my other casual decks. but it counters the spell unless its controller pays 3 mana. So it holds up into the early late game most of the time and counters every spell our opponents want to deploy against us. We also have some hard counter spells, Sinister, Sabotage, and Dissipate. We are choosing to play more Sinister Sabotage because they allow us to sometimes dump an extra instant or sorcery into our graveyard, and sometimes we just need the card selection to find an additional land or something like that. And Dissipate is also useful against something that would recur from the graveyard, but Sinister Sabotage, in my opinion, is the better option for our deck. That's why we are leaning into the Sinister Sabotage here. So were all the non-land cards in our deck. Let's talk about the lands. This is a very, very cheap mana base, and those are just some lands I had lying around. Is It Boilerworks is a very powerful land because it is like two lands in one land, because you return a land to your hand and can play the land later on or discard it to one of your 5 mana card draw spells. This is pretty slow. It enters the battlefield tapped, unfortunately, but the advantage of returning a land to our hand and having more lands to play in the later parts of the game can be very big. We also have Prismari Campus, which is a common land, dirt cheap, but it is slow. It enters the battlefield tapped. But if we hold our mana up for a counterspell and our opponent isn't doing anything, we can activate this to scry 1 and filter our next draws, set up to find a rise from the tiles, or yeah, or we can just try to find a new card draw spell to refill our hand. Swift for the Cliffs is a classic draft land. It enters the battlefield tapped, it gains you 1 life, and it fixes your mana. This is, I would say, it is a playable option in my casual environment. Sometimes the 1 life is very strong against aggro decks, but it is never a land that is outstandingly amazing. We also have some basics: 9 islands, 5 mountains, and the Spikefield Cave, which isn't a basic, it is the backside of the 1 mana red spell I showed you earlier, which is dealing 1 damage. Yes, these are just your bread and butter lands. Everybody has them, and to build a cheap mana base, you have to play a couple of basics because the dual lands that come into play untapped are usually more expensive. We have one rare land, which is just a favorite of mine. It is Desolate Lighthouse. This allows you to pay 3 mana and draw a card, then discard a card. So if you are stuck with many lands in hand or some burn spells you don't need right now, you need to find counter spells or a finisher, you can activate this land, preferably at the end of your opponent's turn, and filter your cards in hand, find new things to do. This is just a sweet card and I really enjoy playing with it. It is sometimes a bit awkward because it just taps for colorless mana, but most of the time I was fine with playing one of these. So this is my casual control deck. I hope that you find it that you find it interesting. I'm choosing to play a slower mana base here because I just want this deck to feel fair against all the decks around me in my casual environment. And sometimes control decks can feel very strong if you always have the counterspell and the answer. So figuring out where you have to maybe not hold up a counterspell to play a tapped land is tricky, and in my opinion, it can be very fun. This is also not a deck that is optimized in any way, because the casual meta, the kitchen table meta, isn't really existing. You can build this deck however you want. You can include other cards. I have 3 cards here that I considered including. The first is Blitz of the Thunder Raptor. This can help you take out big creatures, which this deck struggles sometimes with. If we can't counter them on the stack, our burn sometimes isn't enough to deal with a big creature, and this card certainly would help the deck. You could also include something like Ral, is it Viceroy? Or numerous other red and blue planeswalkers that give you card advantage, deal with stuff on the board, and have a game-winning ultimate. This is one of my personal favorites, but there are numerous Jays, Chandras, and other planeswalker you could play in the deck, and they would all be fine. They would all be cool alternative win cons, but I chose to not rely on any planeswalkers in this deck. So far, I didn't really felt like I needed one, but it is certainly fun to play with them, and I would encourage you to try one out in a deck like this, because maybe he will surprise you and be better than you thought. Additionally, I thought about playing a big red sweeper like Burn Down the House, or maybe something like Anger of the Gods. I chose not to. I chose to rely on my cheap burn and my counterspells, but it is certainly an option, because if you fall behind on board, this deck right here is pretty weak. It just has one Pyroclasm and the burn spells, which are good, but sometimes not enough if your opponent gets to slip through your counterspells and build out a big board. This is where a card like Burn Down the House would really help to control the board, reset it, and this card also has the additional mode to create 3 1/1 red devil creatures, which can be very good against matchups where you don't need the board wipe. So this is also a card worth trying out in a deck like this. So this was my blue-red control deck. I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and yeah, maybe I will talk about some other casual decks, like my black-white mid-range slash hate bears deck that I recently built. And yeah, see you soon.